This movie is set in the year 2024, almost 4 years after the first onset of the deadly coronavirus. Even after trying almost everything, the virus continued to mutate and affect people. At present, this lethal virus has mutated into a far more deadly version of itself, which is known as COVID-23. Unlike its previous variant, this virus eats at the brain of its victims and finishes them off within 48 hours. Because of this, several countries in the world were forced to create quarantine zones, also known as Q zones, for victims who have been affected severely. They are placed inside the Q zones and treated very harshly, because the mortality rate has risen to a scary 57%. Furthermore, some people who are now immune to the virus are named monies, and are the only ones allowed to step outside without any issue. In order to exercise this right, they are supposed to wear a yellow bracelet at all times. Moving forward, the movie opens in a very desolate place. In this dystopian world, almost everyone stays inside the comfort of their homes and never comes out. The only ones who can travel and live freely are the monies. One day, a young man named Nico bikes through a very secluded area to deliver some parcels to his client's house. Since he is immune to the virus, he works as a motorbike courier and caters to all his rich clients' needs. When Nico finally reaches his client's house, he places the parcel in a UV sanitation box and waits for his tip. But much to his dismay, he ends up getting berated by the customer for being late. Frustrated, he proceeds to drive away. The scene now changes to a montage of people expressing just how scared they are. A news reporter informs all the citizens that the global mortality count has reached 110 million. Some other people claim that this is the apocalypse itself. It's evident that the situation of the world is very terrifying. Lockdown has been placed in full effect, and if anyone fails to comply to the rules, they will be shot on sight. Moving forward, the scene now shifts to a man named Lester, who happens to be the owner of a delivery company named Lester Gets. During these tough times, he and all his employees deliver packages of all sorts to their rich clients. In order to make sure that the parcels get delivered, Lester tracks all his employees and gives them the directions to their client's house. He also tracks Nico down, who appears to be just loitering around and not actually delivering any packages. Upon seeing this, Lester scolds Nico for being irresponsible and demands that he take his job seriously. In response, the latter just shrugs and starts biking towards his destination. As the movie progresses, we see a very rich and elite family quarantined inside the premises of their massive mansion. Amongst them is Emma, the 12-year-old immunocompromised daughter of William and Piper Griffin. Since she's very vulnerable to the virus, Emma is forced to stay inside her house and just watch TV all day. Her mother, Piper, even refuses to let her friends inside the house because of her delicate situation. Because of this, Emma laments her monotonous life and curses herself for being weaker than normal people. Furthermore, despite being immune herself, Piper continues to remain confined inside her house so as to not affect her daughter. Every day, all the citizens of the country are required to take temperature scans on their phones to make sure that they have not been infected. Emma herself takes the scan early in the morning, and then continues on to the rest of her chores. On the other hand, Emma's father William continues working out in his home gym whilst eagerly watching the news. Whilst exercising, he comes to learn that the situation is getting worse than before. He also finds out that a new Q zone has been established in their city for all the newly affected people. However, the place seems to be getting a lot of backlash for treating the victims in a barbaric way. Just as William finishes taking his temperature scans, the doorbell rings, and Nico appears at gates of the mansion. It turns out that he's delivering a special package to the Griffins. When Emma sees Nico walking towards the door, she smiles at him and talks about how he is lucky to be allowed outside. Shortly after receiving the parcel, Piper hands Nico a hefty tip and wishes him all the best. Now elated, the latter expresses his gratitude towards them and happily walks away. The scene now shifts to one of the numerous Q zones in the country. The situation inside the place is absolutely terrifying, as there are bodies all around. Not just that, all the infected people appear to be congested together, where they are either left to expire or forced to get better. Meanwhile, Nico finally returns back to his office and calls his girlfriend, Sarah. The two greet each other happily and talk about their day. As Sarah isn't immune, she is forced to stay inside her home with her grandmother. Because of this, she can only talk to Nico through a video call. After conversing for quite some time, Nico finally hangs up and gets ready for his next drop-off. On the other hand, Lester, who had been working on the parcels, receives a message from his client stating that they still haven't received their package. Frantic, he immediately sends out a drone to track his courier. Back at the Griffin's mansion, Piper gets a call from a man named Gwen, who asks her for passes to travel through the city. It turns out that Piper secretly sells black market safety passes for people who want to leave their homes. She charges a lot of money for it, but somehow gets the job done. Moving forward, Piper readily agrees to Gwen's request and immediately starts contacting her associate. The scene now shifts back to Lester, who finally manages to track his courier down. Surprisingly, it turns out that the employee who hasn't dropped off his parcel yet is none other than Nico. After realizing this, Lester sends Nico a message warning him about being watched. In response, the latter just flips him off and continues moving. He gets past the strict guards and eventually delivers the parcel. Soon after, he goes back home and lives in complete isolation, because being in contact with any other non-immune person is incredibly dangerous. After a long day of work, Nico freshens up and starts counting all the money he has saved up. Fed up of living alone, he plans to buy some black market safety passes in order to run away from the city with Sarah. Whilst talking to the latter, he asserts that once he is done saving enough money, he will take her and travel to Big Sur. Upon hearing this, Sarah just smiles and talks about how excited she is. The very next day, Nico gets ready for work again. However, just before heading out, he visits his old office and reminisces about the time before COVID. The scene now changes to a young singer named May, who does livestream shows and paid song covers for a living. In order to entertain people, she posts all her performances online, and even sells covers of numerous songs. One of her biggest fans is a handicapped man named Michael, who happens to work for Lester as a drone operator. Every day at work, Michael tunes into May's channel and chats with her. He even asks her to sing his favorite songs, and the latter happily obliges. Aside from Michael, William and Sarah also listen to May. One day, while Sarah is listening to May's cover, the doorbell suddenly rings. Worried, she walks up to the door and sees Nico standing outside. Now elated, Sarah immediately video calls him and asks him what he's doing out there. In response, Nico simply sends her a small note with a box of pencils. Since Sarah loves drawing, Nico had stolen some pencils from his office as a gift to her. Love-struck, he just stands outside Sarah's door and talks to her for quite some time. Shortly after, he gets a call from Lester asking him to start delivering all the important parcels. After saying goodbye to Sarah, Nico drives away and begins traveling towards his client's house. On the other hand, May continues singing for all her fans. After ending her livestream, Michael sends her a huge donation. Grateful, she sends him a thank you message. Michael replies almost immediately and continues chatting with her for quite some time. Eventually, the two start bonding with one another. May even video calls Michael and asks him all about his day in the military. She listens to all his struggles and tries her best to sympathize with him. As a result, the two grow closer than ever before. Meanwhile, Nico finally finishes delivering all his parcels for the day. At night, he sets up a date with Sarah by projecting a movie on his wall. The two talk via video chat and enjoy the movie together. However, just as the two are watching the movie, Sarah's grandmother Lita walks in with a raging fever. Worried, Sarah immediately checks on her grandmother and finds out that her health is rapidly deteriorating. She tries to think of a way to solve things, but that's when the authorities show up at her apartment building. Men in large hazmat suits walk out of a government van, with a man named Emmett Harland. Moving forward, as soon as Harland walks out of the vehicle, he runs into a man who previously escaped the Q-zone. The man begs for mercy, but Harland brutally stabs him, ultimately murdering him on the spot. When Sarah sees this, she hides Lita inside her room and carefully looks out of her apartment for any soldiers. Not long after, she sees Harland and his quarantine workers forcefully taking her neighbor away. Now petrified, Sarah quietly hides inside her apartment whilst all her neighbors get dragged away to the Q-zone. When Nico realizes that Sarah is in danger, he immediately rushes to her aid. On the other hand, Sarah continues hiding inside her flat. However, she soon hears Harland knocking on her door to ask her questions about her neighbor. In order to avoid any deadly situation, Sarah timidly answers all of Harland's questions. Thankfully, the latter believes her and quickly leaves, after warning her to stay cautious, because there has been a massive surge of COVID cases in her apartment building. After making sure that she's finally safe, Sarah immediately checks in on Lita and hands her the medications. Nico also reaches the apartment right then and calls Sarah. When the latter picks up, she informs Nico that her grandmother has a really high fever. Scared, she tells him that she doesn't want to go to the Q-zone. In response, Nico calmly assures her by saying that she'll be alright. He then stays outside her apartment for the entire night whilst she continues to take care of her grandmother. Back at the Griffin's residence, William gets ready and tries to sneak out at night. However, Piper catches him red-handed and asks him what he's doing. In response, William simply makes up an excuse and says that he's going to get the safety passes for their business. Upon hearing this, Piper tries to stop him for the sake of their daughter, but William starts arguing with her by saying that selling the passes is their only source of income at the moment. He then storms out of the place angrily. Meanwhile, Sarah finally finishes tending to Lita and goes to her door. She then calls out to Nico, who immediately responds to her. Scared and anxious, both of them press their foreheads against the door and talk about sweet nothings. They try to distract each other by reminiscing about their past memories. At one point, Nico even tells Sarah that he loves her a lot, and will do anything to get her out of this dystopian city. On the other hand, after William finally leaves, Piper goes to Emma's room and sees her crying. Incredibly worried, she asks Emma if anything is wrong. That's when the latter sobs and apologizes to Piper for being weak. Guilt-ridden, she talks about how she has made everyone's life miserable. Needless to say, Piper is heartbroken to hear this, so she instantly comforts her daughter. She goes on to tell Emma that she loves her and wouldn't have her any other way. The scene now changes to May dressing up in a sultry costume. Just as she gets ready, William walks in with his mask on. Surprisingly, it turns out that he has been hooking up with May for months behind Piper's back. Once inside, William sits down and waits for May, who soon walks up to him and starts seducing him. It's evident that she's not comfortable with William, but sadly, she has no other choice. She kisses him passionately and spends the night with him. The next morning, Sarah timidly goes up to Lita and proceeds to take her temperature scan. Despite passing her own check, Lita gets detected with a high fever, which immediately alerts the Q-Zone guards. Now incredibly scared, Sarah hugs Lita tightly and starts sobbing. Upon hearing Sarah's cries, Nico gets really worried and calls out to her. He then pounds loudly on the door. Shortly after, Sarah walks over to the door and informs him that the guards are coming for her. Whilst crying, she tells him that she will soon be escorted to the Q-Zone. When Nico hears this, he starts to panic. With no other way out, he begs her to just run away with him. However, the latter refuses to do so, and goes on to tell him that she doesn't want to leave her grandmother alone. After realizing that the authorities are nearby, Sarah emotionally bids Nico goodbye. However, Nico doesn't budge, and assures her that he will secure the safety passes one way or the other. Before leaving, he promises to get her out of the barbaric place. He then runs out of the apartment building and immediately calls Lester for help. Whilst panicking, Nico explains the entire situation to Lester and begs him for help. The latter initially pretends to have no idea about the immunity passes. However, after seeing Nico's distraught state, he finally explains that the main sellers of the bracelets are the Griffins. He further goes on to say that all the packages he has been delivering to Piper had the passes in them. Upon realizing this, Nico sets out to score the immunity bracelets. He immediately drives home and gathers all the money he has saved up. Shortly after, Nick rushes to the Griffins' residence and just barges into their mansion. After waiting for a while, he finally gets in contact with William. Now more desperate than ever, he asks the latter about the bracelets and offers him all the money he has. Unfortunately, as soon as he mentions the passes, Piper immediately hangs up the call. Enraged, she yells at William for blabbering about their illegal business to everyone, and ultimately endangering their safety. Scared for her family's welfare, Piper calls Nico again and tells him that she can get him the passes. She then inquires as to who told him about their illegal bracelets. Thankfully, Nico makes up a lie and says that he just came to them for help as they're rich and might have such connections. Eventually, Piper believes him and gives him a fake address just to get him off her back. Soon after getting the address, Nico races through the city in search of the passes. Meanwhile, the quarantine soldiers reach Sarah's apartment and decide to knock down her door. Inside, she tends to Lita and tries her best to comfort her. Sadly, Lita's health continues to deteriorate. Just before drawing her last breath, Lita wishes Sarah all the best and asks her to run to Nico as soon as possible. In the meantime, Nico reaches the address given by Piper and begins searching around for a clue. He enters a completely isolated warehouse and walks towards a secluded room. However, as soon as he enters the place, he sees Harlan standing in front of him. Initially, Nico thinks the latter is there to give him the passes. Since Harlan is immune himself, Nico trusts him and gives out Sarah's personal information. But soon, he realizes that this is all a trap. He tries to get out of the warehouse, but Harlan catches him and stabs him brutally. It turns out that Piper sent Harlan to finish off Nico so that their business remains safe. Moving forward, Nico somehow manages to fight Harlan off and run to safety. However, the latter's soldiers track him down and start shooting at him. With no other option left, Nico hides in the warehouse's basement. Just when he's about to get caught, a stranger barges in and fights off all the soldiers. The man, whose name is Boomer, drags Nico to safety and helps him escape the place. Whilst running towards safety, Boomer explains to Nico that Harlan brings all the monies down at the warehouse to slaughter them. He further goes on to say that in order to keep their illegal business hidden, they only sell the passes to the ultra-rich and slay anyone else who knows about their racket. Eventually, both Boomer and Nico manage to shoot all of Harlan's goons. However, more soldiers start coming in and attacking them. Since there's no time left, Nico escapes the place whilst Boomer stays behind and finishes off the rest of the soldiers. On the other hand, William somehow finds out that it was Lester who told Nico about the passes. Enraged, he calls the latter and threatens him to confess out Nico's location. Thankfully, Lester lies to William and tells him that Nico turned off his GPS hours ago. Upon hearing this, William furiously hangs up the call and tries to look for other ways to track the runaway courier. The scene now shifts to May talking to Michael. It's evident that the two have formed a very strong bond. After listening to Michael's story, May tells him all about her life problems. Frustrated, she tells him about how William first lured her into the city by offering to sign a record deal with her. However, when the pandemic hit, he canceled the deal and promised to give her an immunity bracelet. Then with May all alone and stranded, William blackmailed her into getting intimate with him. After learning all this, Michael feels really bad for May and tries to lighten the mood. However, that's when May gets a text from William, saying that he will come to her soon. Immediately after seeing the text, May starts to panic. Michael quickly notices this and asks if she needs any help. However, May refuses the offer, claiming that she can handle things on her own. On the other hand, Nico finally gets back to his house and immediately tends to his wounds. He then calls Sarah and asks her if she's okay. In response, the latter just sobs and informs him that Lita is no more. Scared, she begs him to come and get her. Sadly, without the passes, Nico has no way of helping her. Panicking, he asks her to stay safe. Furthermore, he suggests that she hide somewhere so that he has enough time to find the bracelets and come get her. Eventually, Sarah agrees to the plan and braces herself for what's coming. With no time to spare, Nico gets ready again and walks out to find the bracelets. At the same time, Sarah also musters up all her courage and prepares herself for the worst. Meanwhile, William continues to text May relentlessly. Despite the latter saying that she doesn't want to meet ever again, he doesn't stop messaging her. Now more frustrated than ever, William starts threatening her. However, May doesn't budge and asks him to back off. Shortly after, William calls May and starts to get aggressive, yelling at her for betraying him. That's when the latter informs him that she has multiple recordings of him offering her the black market passes. Furthermore, she tells him that she even has videos of them together. It turns out that May secretly recorded all of their conversations, in case things got out of hand. Scared and anxious, William tries to convince May to delete the videos. However, unbeknownst to him, Piper overhears the entire conversation. When she realizes that William will go to any lengths to visit May, she hides all of his gear and threatens him to stay inside. Furious, Piper tells William that she doesn't care about him cheating on her. She further explains that the only thing that she is worried about is their daughter's health. Having no other choice, Piper threatens him at gunpoint and ultimately kicks him out of the house. As soon as William leaves, Nico sneaks into the mansion and tries to find the immunity passes. Meanwhile, Piper calls May to inform her all about William's plan. She tells the latter that he's coming to end her and asks her to leave the house as soon as possible. Right at that moment, Nico enters the house and starts looking around for a clue. However, Lester, who had been tracking him the whole time, realizes what he's up to and immediately calls Piper. On the other hand, the Q-Zone guards finally arrive at Sarah's building and walk towards her apartment. Seeing this, the latter films them and tries to find a secure place to hide. In the meantime, Piper gets her gun ready and immediately rushes to Emma. Incredibly worried, she asks the latter to hide and not come out. The scene now shifts to Harland and his goons, banging on Sarah's door. When Sarah realizes this, she immediately grabs a bat and prepares to fight the soldiers. Within moments, Harland knocks the door down and barges in. He looks around menacingly and ultimately finds Lita's body. He then starts looking around for Sarah. A couple other soldiers also begin to search for her. Thankfully, the latter manages to fight one off and take his hazmat suit. She then wears the suit herself and pretends to be Harland's soldier. Back at the Griffin's residence, Piper finally confronts Nico and threatens to shoot him. Furious, she asks him to step out of the house. However, that's when Nico explains that he isn't there to hurt anyone. Rather, he's just trying to save the last person in his life who's still alive. Now more desperate than ever, he begs her to help him. And thankfully Piper agrees. She reluctantly gives him the pass and enters Sarah's name as a Muni. In the end, she wishes Nico all the best and asks him to take care of Sarah. In turn, Nico thanks Piper and promises to not utter a word of this to anyone. Meanwhile, Sarah somehow evades Harland and his goons and continues to act as a soldier herself. She loads Lita's body into an ambulance and runs away from the place. However, that's when Harland sees his unconscious soldier and realizes Sarah's plan. Enraged, he and his goons start tracking her down. On the other hand, Nico finally secures the passes and rushes towards Sarah's apartment. At the same time, William reaches May's place and sees her running away. Back at Lester Getz, Michael decides to help May and uses his weaponized drone. However, just when the latter is about to run away, William catches up to her and immediately starts attacking her. He begs her to come to him, but when she doesn't listen, he proceeds to choke her. Thankfully, Michael's drone arrives just in time and shoots William right in the head. The scene now shifts to Sarah running away from Harland and his soldiers. But much to her dismay, Harland soon catches her and rips off her oxygen mask. Frantic, Sarah immediately covers her face, but that's when Harland tells her that she's actually immune. After being locked in with Lita, Sarah had to have been infected. But despite taking care of her for a whole day, Sarah wasn't affected, which means that she had been immune all along. Upon realizing this, Sarah asks Harland to let her go. However, the latter just laughs and takes her captive instead. Shortly after, Nick arrives at the apartment building and realizes that Sarah has already been taken away. Whilst panicking, he looks around the entire flat, and that's when he runs into Harland. Confused, Nico asks him who he is. In response, the latter simply replies that he was once a garbage collector. However, after the pandemic, all his superiors lost their lives, ultimately resulting in him becoming the head of the Department of Sanitation. After explaining his previous lifestyle, Harland tries to lure Nico into joining him. With a malicious laugh, he explains how monies are superior to the rest and should have all the power in the world. Moving forward, Harlan continues talking about how he's no longer a human, but a god. He gets closer and closer to Nico and eventually tries to attack him. Thankfully, Nico defends himself easily and in turn stabs Harlan with a sharp pencil, leaving him to bleed out. After escaping the apartment building, Nico races towards the Q-Zone. Whilst driving, he calls Lester and asks him about the transport vehicle's location. Thankfully, he tracks the Q-Zone van pretty quickly and tells him exactly where the vehicle is. With this information at hand, Nico speeds towards his destination. Meanwhile, Sarah finally reaches the Q-Zone. Just when the soldiers are about to drag her inside, Nico arrives at the scene and pulls her away. The two then fight off some of the soldiers there. Whilst doing so, Nico hands Sarah the immunity bracelet and announces to the guards that she is actually immune. Upon hearing this, the guards scan Sarah's bracelet, and as expected, she is proven to be immune. Finally, Sarah is let free. After realizing that she doesn't have to be cooped up anymore, she walks over to Nico and caresses his face. They are now able to touch each other. Overwhelmed with emotions, the two kiss passionately and walk out of the Q-Zone. Shortly after, Nico contacts Lester and informs him that Sarah is immune as well. Upon hearing this, both Lester and Michael sigh in relief. Soon, 3 months pass by, and a lot of things seem to have changed. One day, Lester gets a message from Nico thanking him for the help. In order to express his gratitude, Nico sends him a bracelet of his own. On the other hand, Piper and May team up and frame William and Harlan for selling the black market passes to the wealthy. Furthermore, May starts a virtual relationship with Michael and is now a lot happier. Piper and Emma also live in peace and celebrate their new life together. The movie finally ends with Nico and Sarah riding their bikes to a faraway place and enjoying their life together.